Good morning. I want to talk about finishing your essay, adding the lens portion to your essay. You've got the narrative written, and now you're going to seek new understanding. By the way, your first full rough draft with the narrative and with the lens is due Thursday, April 15th. As I start this lecture, I want to first remind you about what stories do. Stories, narratives provide a way to speak things otherwise unspeakable, to give voice to that which would otherwise go unheard. In other words, as we tell stories, we learn things. We see the impact of experience on people's lives, on the way we live. We see things that we might not have otherwise seen. That's why Barone and Grimm tell so many stories in their research paper. Those stories illustrate what they've learned, the claims that they're making. So in your own narrative, you're remembering things that happened, things related to your literacy. You've got an inquiry question, and the stories are revealing things to you. You are exploring your past to discover something new about yourself, something that might allow others to learn through your story and through their own stories as well. Using a lens is a way to look at your experience in a new way. So you're viewing your story through the claims and assertions of another text in order to gain new understanding, to see things that you might not otherwise see. Now that makes perfect sense if we're talking about actual lenses. But when we talk about text, it's like, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, I think you're familiar with the idea of synthesis, where you're taking two texts, in this case, your story, and Barone and Grimm's text. Synthesis, you put them together and you discover something new. So what we're doing when we do this is we're going to identify relevant claims from the lens text, Barone and Grimm. You might identify a claim first, you might identify a quotation first. It doesn't actually matter, and then you're going to analyze that claim. How do you find those quotations? Start by examining Barone and Grimm. Choose quotations and claims that you think might apply to parts of your narrative, and then enter the quotation on the lens exercise. You've done some of this already, so you may be pretty far along in this process. And then analyze it. What do Barone and Grimm mean when they state this? You can't ignore their meaning and make the quotation say something it doesn't say. You have to think about their context. What do they mean in this discussion? Write the meaning down on the lens exercise. Don't worry if your prose is less than clear. What matters is you're exploring the meaning. So here is a quotation that I want to play with in this lecture. You might be familiar with it. Beliefs about colorblindness, equality of opportunity, and individual effort seep into education from the earliest grades, reinforcing one another and keeping the lid on Pandora's box. These beliefs keep white Americans comfortable, and they protect white Americans from accepting responsibility for honest dialogue about racial differences. What do Barone and Grimm mean? Well, you're going to have to know what colorblindness is. You're going to have to understand what they mean by equality of opportunity and individual effort. You're going to have to know what Pandora's box is, because those are the beliefs that keep white Americans comfortable. Comfortable in what way? How do they protect white Americans from accepting responsibility for honest dialogue about racial differences? What would honest dialogue look like? So in analyzing this quotation, you have to ask questions about the quotation. Here's what I wrote in my analysis, and you'll notice My analysis is much longer than the quotation. So, talking about the trauma of race can make white people uncomfortable. After all, it's hard to justify systems that classified Black people as property and allowed owners to rape, beat, and murder human beings at will. It's equally hard to justify systems that exiled Native people from land they occupied for hundreds of years, took property away from Mexicans living in U.S. territory, or excluded Chinese from citizenship until 1943. It's easier to classify this as history and to assert that things have changed so that Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, has been achieved. Ignoring race allows white people to ignore uncomfortable truths about the number of people who are incarcerated or who are living, I should have said, uncomfortable truths about the number of BIPOC people who are incarcerated who are living in poverty. It allows them to ignore statistics about getting pulled over by police and the disproportionate number of Black people shot by police. It's like keeping the lid on Pandora's box. The evil is there, but white people can't see it. They are comfortable in their belief that all races are equal, and if people of color are impoverished, incarcerated, or not achieving success, it must be because they're doing something wrong. And the more white people avoid the mess of racial history by pretending that racial differences don't exist, the more complacent they become, the more they can ignore questions of injustice, the more they can ignore the discomfort of cognitive dissonance. You'll notice I changed we to white people and they. Why did I do that as I was reading this? Because I am a white person. So I was writing from my perspective, but I was assuming that I was writing to white people. And I don't want to assume that. So I want to change that to make it very specific that it's white people who are ignoring the mess of racial history. Now, using the lens, that's the easy part. I don't know, is that easy? But using a lens is like using deductive or inductive reasoning. Now, because this is the part that you might not understand, but you're probably familiar with deductive or inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning draws conclusions by going from the general to the specific. So you have a major premise. This is a traditional one. All humans are mortal. That's a major premise. Socrates is human. That's the minor premise. So from the general, all humans are mortal, to the specific, Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is definitely mortal. And in fact, this is all true. Socrates has died. This is deductive reasoning. And this logic is a syllogism. If this is true and this is true, then we can conclude this. It only works if both premises are valid. What do I mean? Here's a syllogism I set up. This is Cheddar. Cheddar is no longer with us, but I love this picture of him buried by a blanket. All dogs love bones. Cheddar is a dog. Therefore, Cheddar loves bones. Easy. That's how this works. Again, it only works if all premises are true. As it turns out, not all dogs love bones. And so we can't necessarily conclude that Cheddar loves bones. He did. So we could say most dogs love bones. Cheddar is a dog, therefore Cheddar probably loves bones. And that's how we can make this syllogism work. Inductive reasoning is also like using a lens. It draws conclusions by going from specific to general. Now, you see this pattern up at the top, 10, 20, 30, 40, question mark. You're probably thinking that's 50. And that's how inductive reasoning works. If you have example, 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 you probably know what is going to be next. If we experience something over and over again, we assume that experience is a pattern. There are some problems with that, because what if the next number is actually 80? 10, 20, 30, 40, 80. Now we don't know what the next one is. We're going to have to see the pattern go a few more times. I'll show you the problem with that. Cheddar will balance food on his head. Cheddar is a dog. Therefore, we can conclude that, we can conclude nothing. We can't conclude that all dogs will balance food on their heads. And so there are some definite problems with inductive reasoning. Nevertheless, how is using a lens? You're going to have a claim from Barone and Grimm. This is your major premise, and the story from your name. So if this is true, if color blindness leads to complacency and allows white people to avoid taking responsibility for current injustices, and I was able to ignore injustice as a child and as a young adult, therefore I must have had color blindness. So claim, story, conclusion. That's how the lens works. Sometimes using terms like illustrate, clarify, or extend can help you communicate how the lens allows you to see your story in new ways. So, for example, my ability to look past historic injustices to Hawaiians and other Indigenous people, as well as enslaved Blacks, in addition to my willingness to ignore continued injustice, illustrates how my beliefs about color blindness, equality of opportunity, and individual effort seep into education from the earliest grades. Or I could say the emphasis on liberty and justice for all in textbooks clarifies how these beliefs keep white Americans comfortable, and they protect white Americans from accepting responsibility for honest dialogue about racial differences. Or I could say the discussion about how books can reveal new truths about America and heal the effects of colorblindness extends Barone and Grimm's claim about failure to take responsibility by opening up honest dialogue about racial differences. So to illustrate is to provide an example, to clarify is to explain, and to extend is to say, here's this thing, and if we follow that logic, we can come to this conclusion. These types of words will help you talk about it. So back to this example, because you don't have to use those words. Here's this example, and here is my analysis. As I read this passage from Barone and Grimm, I could see the impact. So I would quote this, add my analysis of it, and then I get to apply it as a lens. As I read this passage from Barone and Grimm, I could see that the impact of colorblindness in my own education. Growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, racism was rampant, but not in my schools. We never talked about race. The books at Pearl Harbor Elementary told me Hawaii was a better place now that it was part of the United States. And in this vein, all of history could be interpreted to reinforce beliefs that triumphs of America, manifest destiny, the institution of democracy, and the American Constitution incomplete sentence. Me writing and not finishing my ideas because I was on to the next one. At any rate, you can see I'm quoting my narrative, and then I'm adding more analysis. Nat Turner's slave rebellion might have started as a noble attempt at freedom, but the slaves crossed the line by murdering women and children. As for the Chinese Exclusion Act, that was another time. I could cling to my assumptions that America had equal opportunity. And I go back to the quotation. You can see I'm revising in my head as I read this over aloud. By the way, that is a really great strategy for revising, is reading aloud and thinking about ideas as you go. And I'm going to continue with my lens. Storytelling from this perspective really did keep Pandora's box closed. See how I'm using that lens? I'm referencing ideas from Bodron and Grimm, and it was easy to become complacent, to ignore my nagging questions about justice and equality. Again, I'm throwing back to that quotation, weaving those ideas into my analysis. I'm using that lens. My schools enforced my beliefs in the American dream, my faith in the premise that opportunity was available to everyone. I didn't realize my own advantages, how my belief in happy endings was fueled by the past. My parents, their siblings, and 3 of my 4 grandparents went to college. This was in my narrative. They led fulfilling lives, and I would too. And because I couldn't see how my family's past shaped my present, I couldn't see how the injustices of the past might shape the present for people of color. And I think that I want to not say friends there, because I had a very small number of friends of color, because in my Colorado school, there weren't a lot of people of color. So I could cling to my belief that we were all the same. The Black girl who sat next to me in 11th grade English, Rick Yee, Carl Grant, Tammy Nakamura, even Antulio, who was known as Tony by white children who didn't like the feeling of Spanish name rolling off their tongues. Again, I'm pulling back to my story because I want to create cohesion. I want to keep this grounded. Bodron and Grimm, application to my story. These students who brought differences of color, class, and culture were expected to make themselves over to match the institutionalized image of the typical student, and so they did. I hope this is a little more clear to you now, what it is you're doing. As you're writing, you can see my emphasis on cohesion. The second part of your essay, the first part of your essay, has a distinct thesis, that main thing that you learn from examining your story. Your second part has a new thesis. What main thing do you learn from using claims from Bodron and Grimm as a lens? That's your new thesis. So you have to think about, how do I build that idea? This is my thesis. Because of the reinforcement of colorblindness in my schools, I never realized the value of recognizing the differences, the way we all benefit when we see unique characteristics of culture. Again, my brain goes and I jump onto new things. Yeah, my process is not super linear. I know some of yours is. And I think that you'll find that your process for the lens, those of you who really like linear, you're going to see that this process is a lot more linear than the previous process. I realized that in order to build this thesis, I have to establish my own claims. And I'm using this lens. Colorblindness hides injustice. Colorblindness reassures white people that everything is okay in the world. Moving beyond color blindness will require recognizing the past and celebrating the differences. And this is true transformation. I'm going to have to establish all of these ideas in order to build my thesis. And so you're going to have to think, well, oh, by the way, you're going to notice that these things are actually claims from Bodron and Grimm. So I'm not just making things up. I'm thinking, how can I illustrate their claims? I want to build cohesion in this so that the first part of my essay moves smoothly into the second part, and it's ultimately all connected in some way. You are building one cohesive essay. That means you're going to need a transition paragraph between the narrative and the use of the lens. What goes in that? Your transition is going to You might use one paragraph, you might use two paragraphs, you want to have some transition sentences. And you're going to want to introduce your lens. You're going to need the title of Barone and Grimm's text, where it was published, when it was published, who the authors are and why they have authority to speak on this topic, what their topic is, and a short summary of their text. This is important. And when you're talking about when it was published, this was published in 2002. And so it's very centered in the time that it was written. And it's okay and perhaps valuable to reference that idea because it's 20 years ago. It's kind of like when you were born. And we might hope that things had changed significantly since that time. Um, and it's okay to use first person and say, although this was written in 2002, it's clear that there are similar issues today, that color blindness has not been abolished, that the kind of transformation they were advocating isn't fully there. So you think about what's going to be most important for your essay. In your transition paragraph or paragraphs, you're going to want to introduce your project, which is to use Barone and Grimm's discussion about blank, about color blindness, or about productive diversity, or about structural oppression or structural racism as a lens for understanding your story. Now, you'll notice that I got very specific. You're not just using Barone and Grimm as a lens, you're using a specific part of Barone and Grimm as a lens. You can't use the whole thing. Their paper is like 20 pages long. So the more specific you are, the more you narrow your scope. You also need to explain why this is a valuable lens and what you hope to gain through this exercise. And I would encourage you to pull back to the idea that stories are valuable, that stories reveal new things, and that by looking at your story through this lens, you hope to discover something new. And I definitely did. I'm recognizing increasingly, this is a process that I've been on for a long time, where I'm recognizing the color blindness of my past and how it can seep in and how to become aware of it. There isn't, anyways, that's my process that I need to be very honest with. And so it's important that you feel comfortable talking about why this is a valuable lens. Remember, you sort of got to sell your paper to somebody else, and then you're going to introduce your new thesis. After that, your paragraphs are going to build that thesis. And so you're going to want to organize this in a way so that somebody can come to the same conclusion that you did. Now, again, I want to emphasize, be specific. Choose a specific theme from Barone and Grimm as a lens. Choose specific claims and quotations connected to that theme in order to analyze your own story. Make sure you understand how Barone and Grimm build the claims that you identify so you can reference specific parts of the text. Make sure you understand what Barone and Grimm mean by those quotations, or you may misrepresent their ideas. Make sure you're applying your very specific lens to the very specific parts of your narrative, rather than just reinforcing general ideas. This is not a compare contrast essay. This is, here's what they say, here's what that means, here's my story, and here's the conclusions that I can draw. If these things they say are true, and this is my story, then I can conclude this. And you can see, most dogs love bones. Cheddar is a dog. Therefore, Cheddar probably loves bones. And we can draw that conclusion. So, in your reflection, which is due Saturday and which I'll accept through Sunday, I want you to address these two questions. What questions do you have about using the lens? And what theme from Barone and Grimm do you plan on using in your essay? That is it.